Hello and welcome back to another boring story for sleep. The place where history gets quiet, the lights go soft, and your thoughts slow down just enough to let go. Before we dive into tonight's strange and sticky tale of royal grime, take a second to gently press that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And maybe leave a little comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. Are you tuning in from a cozy bed in Canada, a night bus in Poland, or a rainy flat in Scotland? Let us know below. Now breathe in, settle your shoulders, close your eyes if you like, and prepare yourself for something deeply unclean. Because while kings and queens may have worn gold and sipped from silver goblets, what lurked beneath the surface was far less regal. You see, when we think of royalty, we often imagine elegance, refinement, maybe even a bit of divine cleanliness. But the truth about British royal hygiene is darker, smellier, and much more revolting than you were ever taught in school. This isn't a story about palaces. It's about chamber pots, unwashed wigs, and the rank stench of absolute power. And it starts, perhaps, with the most obvious question: did they bathe? The short answer is not really. In fact, many royals went weeks, even months, without fully washing their bodies. Take Queen Elizabeth I, glorious, powerful, legendary, and reportedly bathed only once a month, whether she needed it or not. And by bathe, we don't mean soaking in a tub with soap and scrubbing. We mean maybe stepping into a shallow wooden basin, splashing some scented water on herself, and calling it a day. Her physicians at the time believed that water opened the pores and let disease in, so cleanliness meant staying dry, layered, and perfumed. And she wasn't alone. This was a trend. King James I, Stuart monarch of England, proudly declared that he had not washed his hands in years because he believed they cleaned themselves. This was a man who ruled a kingdom, who signed laws, and touched countless documents and likely spread countless germs. Then there's Henry VIII, a monarch known for many things: his wives, his appetites, his temper, but not for his hygiene. Henry suffered from open sores on his legs, ulcers that would ooze and weep, and these were rarely cleaned properly. Instead, his servants wrapped his legs in layers of cloth and herbs, hoping the scent of lavender or rosemary would mask the rot. The pain was immense, the smell unforgettable, and yet he continued to host lavish banquets and wear fine clothes as if nothing was wrong. Inside his chambers, the smell must have been unbearable. Imagine the heavy drapery soaked with sweat, the woolen garments never washed, the velvet cushions hiding decades of use. The concept of laundry, as we know it, didn't apply. Royal clothing was rarely cleaned. Instead, it was brushed, aired, and doused in perfume. Underwear was minimal or non-existent, and don't even ask about socks. But the filth didn't end at the surface. Let's talk about toilets, or more specifically, the royal approach to not having them. For centuries, British palaces had no proper plumbing. Instead, monarchs relieved themselves in close stools, elaborate wooden chairs with padded lids, and a chamber pot hidden underneath. These were often carried around from room to room, so the king or queen could go whenever the mood struck. The person responsible for emptying and cleaning the stool was called the groom of the stool, a title that sounds absurd today, but was once one of the most trusted and prestigious positions at court. This man knew the monarch's most intimate routines. He recorded their bowel movements. He knew what consistency was normal. And yes, he cleaned them afterward. And you thought your job was weird. But worse still was the smell that lingered throughout every palace hall. Without sewage systems, waste was often dumped into nearby rivers or into moats, or just thrown from windows into the streets below. The Tower of London, for instance, had a primitive waste chute that led straight into the Thames. And even in the grandest of homes, waste buckets were stored in closets or behind tapestries. One nobleman visiting Hampton Court complained that the entire building reeked of urine. The walls themselves absorbed it. Now imagine spending every day in those rooms, in gowns and robes never cleaned, sitting on cushions filled with horsehair and sweat, breathing air thick with body odor, rotting food, burning candles made from animal fat, and incense desperately trying to mask it all. The royal bedchambers, far from being romantic retreats, were often crawling with lice. These creatures lived not just in hair, but in the seams of clothing, in bed linens, and in wigs. Royals shaved their heads to avoid lice, but then wore heavy wigs powdered with flour and starch, perfect breeding grounds for more insects. And they rarely removed them. The wigs grew musty, greasy, infested. It wasn't uncommon for nobles to scratch through their wigs with ivory combs during meetings, dislodging lice onto the floor without shame. The floors were rarely cleaned either. Rushes or straw were often spread across the ground to absorb spills and waste, and were left for weeks or months before being replaced. These rushes mixed with food scraps, spittle, soot, animal droppings, and insects. Even in the king's dining room, even at coronations. And when royals traveled, they didn't escape the filth, they took it with them. Portable chamber pots, traveling wigs, trunks filled with musty linens and moth-ridden cloaks. The same servants, the same smells, the same grime, just packed into carriages and paraded from castle to castle. Soap was a luxury item, used more for laundering cloth than for skin. The soaps that did exist were made with lye and animal fat, harsh, abrasive, and not particularly pleasant. Royals might wash their hands before meals, but rarely their whole bodies. Instead, they relied on scents, rosewater, vinegar, cloves to mask the human stench that followed them everywhere. Court physicians encouraged this. They believed strong perfumes kept disease away. So people carried pomanders, little balls filled with herbs and spices around their necks or waistbands, to sniff when the air got too thick. The royals had versions of these tucked into their sleeves and bodices. They were basically walking sachets. And yet, despite all of this, they believed themselves clean. The presence of silks and jewels, of Latin prayers and velvet robes, created a veneer of order and control. But beneath that lay a very human truth. They stank. They suffered. They bled. They sweated. They rotted. And they hid it behind ritual, behind perfume, behind protocol. Because hygiene was not just about health, it was about class. To be royal was to rise above filth, even if you reeked of it. Even if your chamber pot overflowed. Even if the dog at your feet had cleaner habits than you did. Because no one would say it aloud. Not to the king, not to the queen. Not when their word was law and their filth was holy. So the myth endured. The myth of clean kings, of radiant queens, of perfumed courts and pristine robes. But we know better now. We know what lurked beneath the brocade. And we're only just beginning. It's easy to believe that filth belonged to peasants, that dirt clung only to muddy boots and rough wool, but the truth is, it rose through every floorboard, every staircase, every throne room, and it lingered. In the robes of monarchs and the curls of powdered wigs, the disgusting habits of the British royals were not isolated accidents, but long-standing customs, upheld with the weight of tradition and mistaken science. And as centuries passed, these habits only evolved. They did not vanish. For instance, King George III, the monarch remembered by many for losing the American colonies, was also known for his bouts of madness. But few recall that his hygiene regimen, or lack thereof, may have contributed to his suffering. His clothes were rarely changed, his undergarments, often soiled. His chamber pots were frequently ignored, and his physicians believed in balancing his humors with bloodletting leeches and mercury, all while his skin blistered and his breath stank. And yet he remained draped in velvet and ribbons, addressing Parliament with teeth rotting behind his forced smile. He was not an exception. Queen Anne, who ruled at the start of the 18th century, had 17 pregnancies, many of which ended in tragedy. And yet, while she endured unimaginable pain and loss, she also struggled with a body plagued by gout and obesity. Her mobility declined. Her legs swollen and raw, and bathing was nearly impossible. So her attendants sponged her with vinegar-soaked cloths and doused her with rosewater. But the infection lingered, and her bedding stank, and no one dared say a word. For she was the queen, and queens do not reek, even when they do. Her royal bed was changed once every few weeks. The sheets flipped, rather than replace the lice. Scurried between folds of linen, her corsets unwashed held close to skin that hadn't seen sunlight in months, and yet she was considered refined, dignified, the image of power and grace. But power could not erase the stink. The flies knew the truth, and they did not care for titles. The Georgian period introduced more elaborate court rituals, but still no real understanding of sanitation. Wigs became taller, powdered more heavily with mixtures of flour starch and sometimes even ground bone to achieve that perfect whiteness. The powder clung to sweat mixed with oils and dust and drooped under. Candlelight servants brushed the wigs but rarely cleaned them. Vermin nested in them, and courtiers scratched openly with ivory combs during banquets. Powder flew from their shoulders as they moved, and the air inside courtrooms thickened, until even the tapestries absorbed the smell. And when candles burned low, the tallow smoke curled through the rot, coating everything in a layer of warmth and deca. Why Queen Charlotte, the wife of George III, was said to be cleaner than most, but even she bathed rarely, preferring instead to perfume her clothes and apply small cloths soaked in aromatic oils to her wrists and neck. Called swatches, these would be pressed against the skin rather than washed away, and the skin beneath would blister or rash, but that was preferable to the scent of humanity. And so she continued, as did those who followed her, even into the Victorian era, when notions of cleanliness began to change. The British royals clung to their old ways. Queen Victoria herself bathed more frequently, but not in the way we imagine. She was carried to her tub by servants, the water often reused between family members and servants alike. Her bath was shallow, the soap minimal, and scented her towels, not always fresh, and though she was more hygienic than her predecessors, she still shared combs, shared linens, shared pins with her attendants. Cross-contamination was common, and illness spread quickly. The royal palaces, despite growing plumbing networks, still struggled with sanitation. Outdated pipes, leaked chamber pots remained in use in upstairs rooms, and the smell often seeped into the carpets and corridors. Prince Albert attempted to introduce more modern practices, but met resistance from staff and nobles who viewed such changes as beneath their dignity. The royal court resisted toilets for as long as it could, preferring screens and attendants over porcelain thrones. And in the servants' quarters, where innovations began, the royals simply never visited their floors, stayed medieval even as London modernized, and when guests were invited to dine at Buckingham Palace, they were advised to avoid the lower wings where smell and damp still reigned, and the Queen's dogs often defecated unchecked, leaving accidents that the footmen were slow to clean, because no one hurries a royal's pet, and no one questions the odor beneath the throne. And all the while these habits were presented to the public as refined, as elevated, while the true stench of royalty was hidden behind silks and ceremony, and the public never knew that Queen Victoria's gloves were sometimes reused without washing, or that the handkerchiefs handed to dignitaries were soaked in vinegar to hide the staleness, or that lace necklines often yellowed with sweat and were simply powdered anew rather than cleaned. When her children traveled across Europe, they carried these customs with them, infecting the royal courts of Germany, Austria, Russia with the same perfume-soaked ignorance, and the myth endured that royalty smelled of roses of lavender, of civet musk and ambergris, and not of bodies and wool and breath and tooth decay and bowels. But the truth has its own odor. It lingers beneath history's perfume, and we begin to smell it now in letters from courtiers who dared to whisper the truth, in memoirs of attendants who washed the basins, in reports of physicians who tried to diagnose through the stench. And so we uncover not shame but humanity, that the royals were not gods, not icons, but flawed, frightened people wrapped in ritual, doing their best to mask what they could not fix, because they too feared disease, they too felt pain, too hated their own smell, and yet they were trapped by status, by myth, by the lie of perfection. And so they powdered and perfumed and posed, all while decay crept beneath their brocade. And now, as we lie in our clean beds with water on tap and soap in bottles and air that moves freely, we can look back, not with disgust alone, but with a strange compassion. Because no one should sleep in a gown they cannot remove, no one should suffer sores in silence while perfumers write poetry, and no child of a crown should scratch their scalp in public while courtiers pretend not to see the lice. Remember them now, not as kings and queens, but as humans. And maybe that is what they always were, and perhaps what we all become when the candles go out and the curtains close and only the smell remains. We like to believe that time moves forward, that knowledge accumulates, and that with each passing century, we become cleaner, wiser, more aware of the body and its needs. But the story of royal hygiene in Britain reminds us that time can loop, that filth can masquerade as tradition, and that ignorance is often disguised as dignity. The further we explore the habits of monarchs, the more we find layers not of soap and water, but of myth. Ritual denial, even in the Edwardian era, where modernity gleamed through industrial progress, and London bustled with electricity, gas lamps, trains, and printed headlines, the royal family still clung to practices rooted in centuries past. King Edward VII, son of Queen Victoria, loved luxury silk slippers, elaborate meals, champagne, breakfasts, but he rarely bathed, and never alone. His servants prepared a shallow bath with rosewater twice a week, and even then he barely submerged. Instead, he relied on talcum powder cologne and carefully tailored garments to maintain the illusion of freshness. His bedding was rarely laundered fully, and when he traveled by train, his compartments were doused in perfume, not cleaned. The same was true of his mistresses, who followed similar routines, one of whom claimed she hadn't washed her feet in a decade, and no one had noticed, because she wore silk stockings. And diamonds, the image of cleanliness, replaced its reality. By the time King George V ascended the throne, cleanliness had become an expectation among the middle classes. Modern plumbing had entered many homes, yet inside the palace old habits died slow. The royal linen closets still stored sheets, yellowed with time, embroidered with crests and moth-eaten edges, passed down through generations and rarely replaced. The beds were turned daily, but the mattresses not aired, the curtains shaken but never washed, and the royal household staff were taught to handle stains with cloth and scent, not soap. The household manuals instructed maids to refresh pillows by dusting, not replacing them, and the carpets thick with decades of soot were merely beaten, never cleaned. During the reign of King George VI, during wartime, as rationing affected every household, the palace tried to set an example, yet even then the royal washrooms remained separate, distant, symbolic, and barely touched. Soap was rationed across Britain, but in the palace it remained decorative. The royal family used soaps carved with initials, stored in boxes lined with silk. More display than function, and the towels embroidered and folded were rarely damp for show, only not for skin. The myth had evolved by then, not just that royals were clean, but that they had always been that way. And history was scrubbed as thoroughly as the records allowed. Queen Elizabeth II came to power with television cameras in her face and a country watching, and so modernity crept in bit by bit. But even she followed routines shaped by the past. Her baths drawn by assistants, her linens arranged in order of precedence, her travel kits prepared by footmen with powders and scented sachets, her gloves often worn multiple times before washing cleaned, with special cloths, not soap, her shoes stored with cedar and lavender, her dresses never dry, cleaned in full, only spot-treated. The new generation too learned these habits not necessarily out of choice, but because the royal machinery demanded consistency, not efficiency. Her grandsons were taught how to dress, how to eat, how to nod, and when to speak, but little changed in how clothing was maintained, or how perfumes replaced washing. And within the grand walls of Windsor or Balmoral, many of the old smells still lingered. Dogs ran freely, and so did their messes. Fireplaces burned peat and wax. The smell of cooked lamb and wax polish mixed with damp stone, and the scent became identity. Tradition was the greatest perfume. The royals could wear a story stronger than soap that said, "This is how it has always been, and so it must be." And yet, beneath that story lay truth unspoken and undeniable, that For all their titles and wealth, the kings and queens of Britain lived, like everyone else, in bodies that sweat and shed and smell, and that no amount of lace or lavender could fully cover it up. Even their coronation robes carried history in. Every seam years of use, barely refreshed, stored in chests. Between ceremonies mothballed and reused, heavy with the oils of those who wore them before, and yet displayed as if new. And in those final moments before a crown was lowered upon a head, before a scepter was lifted, and a crowd applauded, no one ever said aloud that the robes were stale, or the gloves reused, or the throne itself had not been dusted that morning, because that would puncture the illusion. Illusion was everything. Now, as we lie still in our beds, listening to the slow winding of history through quiet breath and calm memory, we can picture them not in portraits, but in the quiet corners between image and truth. In the shadow behind the throne, where the chamber pot once stood, in the silence between footfalls, when a servant tried not to gag, in the rustle of taffeta drawn tight over a body that hadn't seen water in weeks, in the moments when even a queen scratched behind her ear and hoped no one noticed. In those details, we find connection because they were not better than us, not holier or purer. They were just people wrapped in too much expectation and too many layers and too little soap, and that is perhaps the most royal truth of all. Not that they ruled or reigned or conquered, but that they endured, and their grime endured with them, clinging to history like dust on an heirloom hidden in plain sight beneath golden crowns and velvet capes. And when we remember them, when we breathe in the stories told again and again, perhaps we do not smell roses or myrrh or frankincense. Perhaps we smell the truth that even kings were once filthy, and that the crown was not immune to sweat. And that is what makes this history not just interesting, but human. And now, as your thoughts begin to drift, as your limbs grow heavy and your breath deepens, know that sleep is clean and quiet and forgiving, and history can wait until morning. There is something oddly poetic about filth when it is ceremonial, when it is wrapped in velvet, when it is passed from monarch to monarch like a relic, unspoken yet honored. The British royals did not simply endure grime. They inherited it, preserved it, ritualized it. The dirt under their nails was not accidental. It was woven into their titles, their lineage, their myth. The very instruments of royalty were not clean. The coronation spoon, for example, that thin, ornate object used to anoint kings and queens with holy oil, was never scrubbed. Not truly. It was wiped, reverently placed back into its box, and passed along centuries of sweat and oil clinging to its narrow bowl. And when it touched skin again, it brought with it the scent of every monarch. Before the crown itself, heavy with gold and age lined with velvet, was not washed, but only brushed with cloth and silence, and when it lowered onto a new brow, the sweat of that moment joined the unseen collection of all who had trembled beneath its weight. The thrones of the royal palaces, carved wood cushioned in fading fabric, were stained not just by age, but by the pressure of ceremony. Nervous sweat, fear, hunger, indifference soaked into them, and though staff polished the arms and vacuumed the cushions, they never truly erased what lingered. And in that residue, there was a story not told in textbooks, that power does not erase the body, that history cannot sanitize presence, and among the filthiest yet most revered objects were the royal bed linens in Windsor, in Buckingham, in Balmoral. Each set was embroidered, each pressed and folded and documented, but not always washed. Between uses, the royal bed was a place of state, a symbol of fertility, continuity, strength, but also a trap of sweat, perfume, dust. And sometimes worse, when Queen Victoria died, her nightgown was preserved, yellowed, stained, folded carefully and displayed as if holy. And in a way, it was not because it was clean, but because it was hers. And the sacredness of royalty had always included the unspeakable and the disgusting. The royal robes, worn only for state events, were lined in fur, heavy velvet brocade. Yet many had never been laundered, not fully. They were stored in cedar, but moths still found them. The oils from skin pressed into the seams grew sour with time, and when new monarchs wore them, they did so knowingly, surrounded by the scent of old power and aged fear. And then there were the gloves, the endless gloves worn to shake hands, to wave, to touch. Without touching, they came. In ivory, satin, and cream kid leather, in embroidered lace, and most were not washed, just aired. Powdered, stored, many were reused across generations. Some bore invisible traces of long-dead fingers, and yet they were symbols of decorum, of dignity, of civility, they said. Look how refined, look how removed. But the truth was always, closer gloves did not stop sweat from pooling rings, from sticking nails, from yellowing beneath. They only covered it up, and that covering up was the point, because so much of royal hygiene was not about cleaning but hiding it. Was the illusion of cleanliness, the theater of grace, and it extended to the objects they carried. Fans to hide breath, scents to hide smell, powders to hide oil, parasols to shield from sun, not for comfort, but to maintain the illusion that royals did not sweat, that their skin was different, untouched, immune. Nay, and yet their boots still wore mud. Their drawers still stained, their collars still yellowed, just like anyone else. Their perfumes, though exotic and rare, were not strong enough to mask the closeness of bodies during court gatherings in rooms sealed shut to keep out the cold. The air would thicken, with breath, with musk, with damp, and yet no windows were opened. No servants moved to refresh the space, because ceremony required stillness and odor was a sacrifice for order. And as time moved forward, the royal families developed even more intricate rituals to preserve this illusion. Perfumes were layered, scented envelopes were placed among linens, sachets buried in drawers, lavender hung in wardrobes, camphor balls scattered beneath chairs. Even inkwells were scented, yet nothing truly cleaned, and so the residue remained more elegant. Now perhaps more carefully managed, but no less presented. Crept through gloves and into upholstery, it stuck to portraits and clung to window frames. It filled the cracks in floorboards and whispered behind tapestries, and those who worked in the royal households knew this better than anyone. The maids, the footmen, the launderers, they were the silent record keepers of filth. They boiled the sheets when allowed, scraped the wax from candelabras, scraped the floor where a dog had relieved itself, where a drunken duke had spilled gravy, where a child had vomited during rehearsal for a state dinner. And none of these were discussed. None entered the record only. The shine remained. Only the edited version passed on, and the objects themselves complied. The silverware remained polished. Even when handled by dirty fingers, the teacups passed down with hairline cracks still held bitter brew. The tiaras worn over itchy scalps still sparkled under chandelier light. No matter what lay beneath the objects, told a different story, a cleaner one. And the people believed it because we want to believe that power is above such things, that royalty is immune to stench, to skin, to sickness, and yet, we know it's not, because illness always betrayed the truth. Dysentery struck courts just as it struck fields. Colds swept through royal nurseries, no matter how many lace pillows lined the crib. And when the royal physicians arrived, they arrived not with soap, but with syringes and salts and leeches, and oil. And so the cycle continued. The objects were polished. While the people decayed, the rooms were aired, while lungs collapsed. And over time, these rituals became sacred, and sacredness resisted sanitation. Because to cleanse fully would be to strip away the past, and the past was precious, even when it stank. And so the British royal family remained suspended. In this space between rot and reverence, the dirt was real, but the narrative was pure, and the objects played their part. And as we lie now in our own rooms, perhaps quiet, perhaps clean, we imagine these relics not as symbols, but as witnesses. Because a spoon that has touched 100 royal foreheads has also smelled 100 royal scalps, and a glove that waved to millions has also hidden trembling, and a bed that bore a monarch has also held silence, sweat breath, dreams, and fear. And in this way, objects become memory, and memory becomes history, and history is never as clean as it claims. Neither are we, and maybe that is all right. Maybe to be royal is to carry the weight of invisible filth and to pretend not to notice, and to let others believe the shine is real even when you feel the stain beneath. They say that power is about what you can command, what you can possess, what you can avoid. But in the royal palaces of Britain, power was also about what you never had to touch. Dirt, for instance, waste, illness, discomfort. These were the domains of others. The silent army beneath the crown, the servants, the cleaners, the dressers, the ones who carried away the filth without ever allowing it to appear in view, the ones who ensured that the illusion remained whole, the ones who understood that the cleaner the surface, the more secrets it had to hold. And so the life of a royal was built upon the backs of those who managed their bodily functions with discretion and discipline. Chamber pots were not emptied by queens, the sheets were not changed by kings, and yet the stench lingered because no amount of hierarchy can remove biology. And so every morning began with a routine less divine than design. The valets would knock, gently enter, silently open the drapes, slightly, never, all at once, and begin the ritual. The nightclothes were removed, examined quietly. Any stains, noted but not remarked upon. The basin was filled, not with running water, but with lukewarm bowls, scented with herbs. Cloths were soaked, not rinsed, just dabbed, and then set aside for washing by someone else. Always someone else. The used cloths would be boiled, but rarely bleached, and the basins themselves sometimes retained a sour smell. The soaps were rare, expensive, carved, shaped, not for cleaning but for gifting. The ones actually used were plain, unscented, bought in bulk, and hidden from view. And once the royal had dressed with help, of course, the room was left for airing, windows cracked. Just an inch linens pulled back, but not replaced unless stained beyond hiding. And even then they were sometimes flipped, reversed, tucked. And so the mattress might remain unchanged for weeks, months. Even the underside of the bed rarely dusted because the effort of moving it required too many hands and too much disruption. And so filth settled where eyes didn't reach. And when the servants cleaned, they cleaned around dirt, never through it. The edges of mirrors sparkled, but the corners held dust. The floors were polished, but the baseboards remained gray. The wardrobes were perfumed, but the shoes inside often reeked of sweat, trapped leather and damp, and yet no one spoke of it because to mention it was to break the spell, and the spell was what kept the world spinning. And so they swept silently, they scrubbed quietly, they pinched the soiled linens between thumb and forefinger and carried them away without breath. The royal children too were taught from early on that cleanliness was not about soap but about appearance. They were powdered, combed, sprayed, but not always washed. The nurses were instructed to maintain schedule over sanitation, to prioritize behavior over smell, and so many royal nurseries were sweet with perfume and sour beneath with milk, rot dust, old toys, and woolen blankets that had never met water. The cribs lined with lace, hid mattresses stained. Through and through, the dolls passed from sibling to sibling, carried the scent of years, and the wooden toys splintered but kept because they bore initials. Initials mattered more than hygiene. The royal dogs ran through halls urinated on. Carpets chewed on slippers, and no one punished them because they were symbols, living accessories, part of the aesthetic, and their mess was cleaned in silence, never mentioned, never noted, and so the carpets were sponged, never lifted, the smell dulled, never removed, and when guests visited, they noticed, of course. But they did not speak, because one does not insult royalty, even with the truth. And as for the royal kitchens, they too bore secrets behind gleaming silver trays and gold-rimmed china rats. Sometimes ran through the storage rooms, the cold cellars leaked, the firewood smoked the drains, clogged the scullery maids carried pans, so blackened they left soot on aprons, and the dishcloths were used until they tore. Not because there were no replacements, but because waste was unseemly, and so was complaining. And the cooks worked in heat thick with grease. The ceiling above the ovens stained black from decades of steam. The same pots used for every banquet, the same ladles wiped between courses and stored in drawers, where crumbs grew into colonies, and the royal physicians. They knew the truth too. They attended to sores hidden by silk. They treated infections wrapped in lace. They smelled the gangrene beneath velvet and said nothing. Because diagnosis was delicate and discretion mandatory. And so letters were written in code symptoms disguised with euphemism. A rash became fatigue. An ulcer became nerves. A smell became a mystery, to be endured, not resolved, and the records were edited, histories rewritten. And still the bodies decayed, just the same. And over time, this pattern became not just habit, but identity. To be royal was not to be clean, but to be untouchable. And that meant never acknowledging filth, only redirecting it, disguising it, renaming it, and placing it somewhere. Else somewhere beneath, behind, under carpet or cloth or title. And the servants understood this. They became experts in erasure, in invisibility. They carried vinegar in pouches to mask smell. They learned to breathe through mouths, not noses. They soaked their hands in salt, to dull sensation and their own. Clothes absorbed the stench of the palace so completely that they were sometimes banned from entering public spaces after shifts. And no one asked why, and no one apologized, because they were part of the machine, the necessary layer between myth and matter, and they believed in it too, most of them, because belief was a survival strategy. And so they kept the floors shining and the sheets tucked and the spoons gleaming and the stories intact, and the royals smiled and waved and slept in beds that smelled of centuries. And no one said a word, and still no one says a word, because we have inherited the silence, just as they inherited the grime, and we admire the gold without asking about the sweat that polished it. We cheer the pageantry without wondering about the hands that ironed the robes. We marvel at the jewels without asking who cleaned the clasp, and that is the nature of history. Forgets on purpose. It edits with precision. And tonight, as you sink into your own bed, soft, warm, perhaps newly washed, imagine the opposite. Imagine a world where nothing was ever fully cleaned, only rearranged, and where people lived, not above filth but beside it, and called it tradition, and wore it like armor. And that is the stow. Rye of royalty, not glory, but grime, the invisible history beneath the throne. There is something sacred about rot, when it is ancient, when it is inherited, when it is wrapped in protocol and hidden behind gold, when dirt is no longer filth. But a form of continuity, the British royals understood this. Not consciously perhaps, but viscerally. It was in their breath, their linen, their silence. And so as time marched on and plumbing arrived and antiseptic ideas made their way across Europe, the palaces remained slower to adapt, not out of ignorance, but out of reverence for routine. The pipes installed were not for washing, but for symbol. The water flowed, but rarely used for scrubbing. It was ceremonial more than practical, because to change too much too quickly was to break the spell. The old basins remained. The old rituals survived. And the concept of cleanliness shifted. It became performance. Scented towels folded 3 times, soaps carved into royal crests, baths filled with rose water, but only stepped into once a week, maybe twice, if illness demanded, and even then not for soaking but for steeping like fabric in dye and afterward. The towels were burned or buried or reused, depending on the year, the reign, the fashion of hygiene at court. And still the mattresses were rarely changed. The curtains still held dust. The footstools remained sticky beneath the polish. And in every room the air told stories. No historian wrote the smell of wool heated by candlelight, the tang of dried sweat on silk, the sharp rot of a forgotten fig left behind after supper. No one spoke of these things, but everyone knew. And so the training continued. Young royals were taught early, not how to bathe, but how to appear clean, how to smile without bearing teeth, how to stand still so sweat would not show, how to hold breath politely during moments of odor, how to pretend that silk did not cling, that lace did not itch, that crowns did not chafe. And this was the education that mattered, because diplomacy required composure, and composure required denial, and denial required training. And the older royals modeled This beautifully Queen Mary of tech wore the same corset daily wiped with cloth, never washed. She said it gave her shape, but it gave her control a kind of stillness that refused to acknowledge the mess beneath King Edward VII bathed. Infrequently, his tub lined with sponges to cushion his bulk, but the water rarely changed between dips. His staff kept the illusion, not the hygiene, and yet they were admired, adored, not despite the grime, but because no one saw it. The dirt was backstage, and backstage was off limits, and those who entered learned quickly what to say, what not to smell, what to endure. A young chambermaid once fainted from the heat in the Queen's dressing room, not because it was hot, but because it reeked of perfume and mothballs and aged fabric and the sweet sick rot of antique cosmetics. She was dismissed not for weakness, but for breaking the spell, and that was the great crime in royal spaces. To acknowledge reality was betrayal, because reality was not. The brand royalty was, and royalty had to feel timeless, untouched, beyond digestion, beyond excretion, beyond aging, even when the evidence clung to every surface. And so, the rooms were scented, the halls perfumed, the flowers rotated, daily not to freshen, but to distract, and the visitors smiled. Took photos later, wrote of elegance, but never of the stickiness beneath the table. The grayness along the grout, the lingering warmth of too many bodies in velvet, in summer, secret. And as the decades turned, modernity knocked louder. Antiseptic soaps, even electricity became harder to ignore. And still, the palaces clung to old rituals. Footmen still ironed sheets with brass heaters. Maids still brushed soot from mantles with damp cloths. Never bleach, never chemicals. Because harsh smells broke the illusion, and nothing mattered more than illusion. The walls might crumble, the roof might leak. But if the tea tray gleamed, if the napkin was folded just so the monarchy would survive, and perhaps it did, because of that, because the rot was familiar, the dust comforting the smell of old wood, and old rules more stable than the sterile scent of change. And the tourists came by the thousands, watched the changing of the guard, marveled at the uniforms, the polish, the dogs, the ribbons, the sashes, the enamel of royal smiles, and never asked how many hands had polished those boots, how many nails had split scraping those floors, how many noses had learned to shut themselves in service of something greater, or perhaps something more hollow. And in that hollowness, there is truth, not shame, but design. Because the British monarchy was never about comfort, it was about spectacle. And spectacle is never clean. And in the quietest corners of those palaces where the light is dim and the windows fogged, you can still smell it if you try the ghost of sweat beneath perfume, the dust in the velvet, the unwashed wood of a chair too sacred to replace. And in that smell is history not written, but breathed. Not honored, but endured. And maybe that is the legacy, the real one. Not crowns or laws or bloodlines, but the shared quiet knowledge that beneath all splendor there is always skin, and skin sweats, and sweats stains, and stains stay. And if you deny it long enough, it becomes sacred. And sacredness is never sterile. It is sticky and strange, and it asks for silence, not solutions. And that is why no one ever really cleaned the throne, because to clean it would be to admit it was just furniture, just wood, just cloth, just a seat, and kings do not sit on chairs. They sit on symbols, and symbols cannot be soiled, even when they smell, even when they rot, and even when they creak beneath the weight of centuries of bodies pretending to be more than flesh. They say cleanliness is next to godliness, but in the world of British royalty, it was next to protocol, next to appearances, next to the weight of tradition. And beneath all that, it was twisted, reshaped, redefined, until it no longer meant clean, but rather presentable, tolerable, respectable. And that meant that the objects associated with hygiene were never simply tools, they were symbols. Mirrors of status, extensions of identity, and in their strangeness, they revealed how far removed the monarchy had become from the bodies. They occupied royal toothbrushes, for instance, were rarely their own. They were often used communally within the family, replaced only when bristles fell out. Handles engraved not for hygiene, but for heritage, and the bristles themselves were made of animal hair boar horse. Even badgers soaked in spirits, not rinsed, not dried, and left in cups on windowsills where mold sometimes grew around the base, and still no one questioned it because the cup was silver, and the initials were royal, and soap, when used at all, was rationed its scent, chosen by committee. Its form dictated by what photograph best captured virtue, the bar itself, sometimes larger than a hand, sometimes too perfumed to bear and rarely finished before it was gifted away. Rewrapped, reused, its surface scratched, but its name intact. And the combs. The brushes, the mirrors were often passed down from monarch to monarch, not because they worked, but because they had touched royal scalps, seen royal faces, held royal strands of hair, and that contact made them sacred, even if they were never washed, never sanitized, never replaced, and so dandruff gathered. Teeth dulled, mirrors fogged, but they remained. They endured, and that endurance was a kind of piety, a refusal to betray the past with bleach or boiling water. And then there were the bidets, the porcelain thrones, not the royal ones, but the hidden ones often tucked behind curtains placed in corners. Never spoken of by name, called chairs or stools or simply arrangements, and these bidets were more symbolic than functional, sometimes dry, sometimes filled with scented cloths, rarely plumbed, rarely flushed, and the cloths themselves were reused, laundered only in the mildest water, hung in private gardens behind ivy walls, and the idea of wiping was discussed only in medical logs, veiled in euphemism managed by attendants who burned the linens after particularly unpleasant episodes, but never told the queen, never told the prince, never mentioned the stains in the wood or the cracks in the porcelain, because to report was to rupture, and silence was smoother than soap, and smoother still were the powders. Talcum-scented chalky, designed not to cleanse but to cover, sprinkled generously beneath corsets, behind ears, within wigs. Powders stuck to sweat turned paste gray, then black, but still, they were applied daily by gloved hands, hands that knew better but did not protest, and the wigs themselves were rarely washed, powdered more often than brushed, infested sometimes with lice, but the lice were combed and catalogued and removed. One by one, never exterminated en masse, because extermination required honesty, and honesty broke illusions, and the illusion was all. And for women, the rituals were even more absurd and more concealed. Sanitary cloths, reused and hidden in boxes, carved with roses stored beneath velvet seat. Cushions sometimes left to dry on sunnels. Balcony's maids instructed to handle them with perfumed gloves, and the royal physicians kept lists coded initials, noting flow and pain and odor, but not for treatment, for protocol, and the perfumes used to mask these truths were weapons. Sharp, suffocating layered jasmine over musk over civet, sometimes layered again before public outings, because smell was strategy, and one had to arrive, not fresh, but formidable. And the same applied to the feet. Shoes were not aired out. They were stored, sealed in drawers, lined with velvet, their insoles damp from sweat, the leather stiff, the soles cracked, but polished until they gleamed, and no one cared how they felt, only how they looked, and so the fungus grew, and the nails curled, and the skin split and bled, and was wrapped in silk socks dyed to match stockings, stitched with care, but never cleaned more than once a month. And when those feet touched royal ground, the floors had already been waxed and sprayed and heated and prepped, not to comfort but to receive, and the hands that touched those floors afterward knew the truth. They scrubbed harder than ever before, not to erase but to believe, because belief kept them employed. And the slippers of monarchs became relics, stored in boxes labeled with dates, not disinfectants, preserved in museums behind glass, never admitting what they once smelled like. And in private royal undergarments were hand-washed by women who wore masks, not surgical but symbolic lace veils meant to honor the intimacy of the garments. but really used to dull the stench. The drawers were soaked, not scrubbed, scented, not sterilized, dried on racks of gold-painted pinewood, left to hang beside state robes and coronation gowns, as if their threadbare cotton bore the same weight and the same fate. And when pressed, they were folded with notes, placed inside lavender petals, verses from Psalms, as if prayer could remove the residue of urine, of blood, of discharge. And perhaps it did, or perhaps it merely distracted, and that distraction was enough. And when kings grew ill and lost control of bowels, of bladder, of memory, the attendants changed the sheets silently, sometimes 3 times a night, sometimes never, because if no one acknowledged the smell, it wasn't real, and the logs would mark the nights with stars or dots or blank spaces, a code passed between generations of servants who knew that documentation had to preserve dignity, not describe decay. And when those monarchs died, their beds were stripped, their linens burned, their bodies washed, not by doctors, but by specialists in royal corpse. Preparation, a role passed from father to son, a trade of silence, a craft of deodorization and illusion. The bodies were soaked in herbs, wrapped in wool, and no one spoke of what was beneath. And after the funeral, the chamber was sealed, the windows opened only days later, and the dust settled again, the ritual reset, and no one ever said what it had smelled like. No one ever wrote it down, because the story of the royal body was never written, only scented, only powdered, only whispered. And even now, centuries later, the archives hold more about perfumes than plagues, more about gowns than gangrene, more about pageants than parasites, because that was the point. Not to record the truth, but to overwrite it with silk, candlelight. And so the next time you imagine a queen in her chamber, imagine not gold and lace, but the heavy scent of powder and old wool, the dampness beneath her corset, the reused cloth beneath her skirt, the toothbrush she shares with her sister, and the basin that hasn't been emptied since morning. And remember, she is not less royal for it, but more, because royalty is not above dirt. It is built atop it, a pyramid of cloth and denial and breath held through centuries of sweet rot. There are histories you read, and there are histories you smell. The latter are harder to preserve, but easier to remember, because scent clings to the body in ways that memory cannot. It seeps into the folds of fabric, into the cracks of wood, into the breath between syllables, and the British royal family understood this not as a truth, but as an apophis. Inconvenience, one to be masked, managed, rebranded, never named thee. Throne was a symbol of grace, of lineage, of power, but it was also a seat, and seats are sat on, and when you sit, you sweat, and when you sweat, you stain, and royal thrones were no different, only more sacred, which meant they were never cleaned. Only dusted, lightly, buffed gently, never scrubbed, and so layer upon layer of human presence built up beneath those golden cushions, the oil of centuries, the salt of bodies, the faint acidic trace of stress and indigestion, and the people who maintained those seats knew never to lift the cushion, completely never to peek beneath, because the illusion depended on the surface being enough, and surfaces were everything. The windows were washed, the mirrors polished, the banisters gleamed, but the corners, the undersides, the backs of wardrobes remained untouched, because behind was private, and private meant untouchable. And that rule extended to the royal teeth, their smiles, public, their mouths, private, and dental hygiene was never prioritized for royals. Not because they lacked the means, but because they lacked the urgency. They were not judged by their breath, but by their posture, and so molars rotted silently, incisors yellowed, the gums receded until blood mixed with tea, and still they smiled, lips tight or wide, depending on the monarch and their pain threshold. And only in private did they rinse with tinctures of clove or vinegar or wine, not to heal, but to numb, and spittoons lined their bedrooms, discreet bowls of pewter or porcelain hidden behind silk screens, emptied by hand by staff who wore gloves and linen masks and never made eye contact, because shame was not allowed, even when the king spat blood, even when the queen gagged on her own stench, and that shameful silence grew roots It spread to the kitchens, the pantries, the cellars where food was stored not by cleanliness, but by code meats. Hung for days past their prime, soaked in spices to hide the smell, not remove it. Milk served, lukewarm bread stored near coal, and still the family ate the prime. Servants gagged quietly and washed the platters in cold water, because hot water was reserved for tea, and only when rats chewed through the flour sacks did anyone call for inspection. And even then, the rats were blamed, not the rot, and then there was the matter of garments, not the outer robes, but the inner layers, the petticoats, the waistcloths, the corset liners. These were worn until they stiffened, until they could stand on their own, folded and stored with sachets of lavender to delay washing as long as possible. Because washing was expensive, not in coin, but in effort, and royal effort was a contradiction. Nothing royal should ever appear to try. And so the gowns were aired, not washed, the trousers brushed, not laundered, the lace beaten, not soaked, and the dirt that remained was called history. The stains were named after years and events. The wine blotch from the Jubilee, the sweat ring from the great, heat the vomit speck from the Queen's fainting spell. All documented by seamstresses who knew better than to ask for replacements, and shoes once polished were never opened again. Boots remained upright on wooden molds, full of dried foot grease and toe crusts, but gleamed under candlelight, so they were considered clean, and when travel was required, and royal carriages rolled through muddy roads, the interiors were lined with silks, never removed, stained with wet dog and smoke and feet, but perfumed daily with amber and rose. And so the scent became confusing, a mix of decay and elegance. Contradiction that embodied royalty itself. And when illness struck, and it always did, the doctors arrived with gloves, not for sterility, but for decorum. They touched sores with sticks, lanced boils with blades dipped in rum, and wiped wounds with strips of curtain no longer fit for windows, and still they bowed after treatment. Still they addressed the Queen as Your Majesty, even as she groaned beneath linen, soaked with pus. And in that contradiction grew a culture not of health, but of hierarchy, where infection was less offensive than honesty, and the air itself became complicit, heavy with candle. Smoke, body odor, rotting wood, dried flowers, all suspended in. Rooms too sacred to ventilate, and so windows were sealed, tapestries nailed tight, chimneys blocked by seasonal decor, and in winter the cold preserved the scent in layers, while in summer it rose from the floorboards like an offering, a reminder of what was endured, and what could not be named. And when children were born into this world, they were swaddled not in fresh cotton but in heirloom, cloths yellowed by time pressed, not washed, perfumed, not boiled, and the nurses who held them did so with sleeves drawn low to mask the scratches from mites, the burns from iron, the chafes from corsets. And when those children cried, it was said to be from temper or bad dreams, never from rash or rot or thirst. And when they grew into teens, they were taught to pretend to pinch their cheeks instead of wash their faces, to pat their scalps instead of comb their hair, to chew clove buds to disguise their breath, and to never comment on the smells around them, no matter how sharp or strange. And in their studies they learned of history and politics and etiquette, but never sanitation, because knowledge of hygiene was practical and royalty was not. When they married, they shared beds, not out of love, but tradition. And those beds were warmed by bricks soaked in wine, wrapped in flannel, carried in by servants who had to hold their breath from the scent of unwashed sheets and wet bodies, and breath held from fear and from duty, and the scent was passed from linen to nose to lungs to memory, and memory was passed to you, and now you carry it, without realizing, every time you picture a royal, every time you imagine lace and velvet and gold. Remember that beneath it was sweat and oil and spit and blood, and that these were not exceptions. Constance, and the difference between royal and commoner was not the absence of filth, but the presence of denial, a refusal to name what was obvious, and to elevate the unclean into the untouchable. And that is the truth. No history book will describe, no museum will scent, no statue will embody, but it lingers, and it breathes, and it waits for you to notice. There is a silence that sits in palaces, not the silence of absence, but the silence of knowing, the kind that hums beneath chandeliers and echoes off gold leaf. A silence built from centuries of omission, carefully curated like a painting, repainted until the original canvas no longer exists. And this silence is the true scent of royalty. Not lavender, not rose, not sandalwood, but silence. The kind that follows rot, the kind that wraps around shame and turns it into myth. And it begins in the corridors, the long, narrow arteries of the royal body, winding from bedchamber to throne room, from kitchen to chapel, lined with portraits whose eyes have watched disease pass like a shadow and never blinked the rugs. Muffled the footsteps, but not the smells. They absorbed them, held them, released them slowly, and those who served there learned not to breathe too deeply. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was inappropriate, and appropriateness mattered more than air. And so they learned to move through it, to wear the stink like armor, like a badge of obedience. And still the myths flourish, the stories of kings who never sweated queens, who smelled of lilies, princes whose hair was always freshly curled. But the linens told another story. They told of fevers that soaked through 7 layers of cloth, of lice that chewed through powdered wigs, of diarrhea that stained royal mattresses, through horsehair and velvet, through down and silk, until they were turned and flipped and pressed and perfumed and never truly cleaned. And still they were passed down, because history mattered more than hygiene. And what mattered most was continuity, that illusion that the monarchy never broke, never bled, never decayed, and to sustain it, every bodily function had to be hidden, disguised, translated into ritual. And the chamber pot became a relic, the sponge a symbol, the bath a performance, and even the act of wiping was no longer practical. It was ceremonial, assisted by attendants trained to avert their gaze, to fold the cloth, just so to speak, only when spoken to, and the cloth itself was monogrammed, not sterilized, scented, not washed, and placed back in the cabinet with reverence. And the towels were never bleached, because bleach was vulgar. They were aired, folded, pressed, and the stains were simply called history. And this pattern extended to every crevice of royal life. The animals kept in the menagerie were not cleaned daily. Their waste collected, ceremonially dumped behind hedges, buried in soil used for royal roses, and the children who played in those gardens were told the scent was natural, earthy, noble. And they believed it, because believing was easier than asking. And in the great halls where banquets were held, the floors were polished until they gleamed, but never mopped beneath the dais. Where food fell and wine spilled, the wood was sticky, the air thick, but guests were seated above it, elevated both physically and socially, and so the illusion held. And when someone vomited, which they often did from too much wine, too little tolerance, it was not cleaned immediately, but surrounded by guards, shielded with curtains. And when the smell became too much, herbs were burned, not to cleanse, but to confuse the senses. Rosemary bay, laurel, frankincense, a fog of denial. And this fog became the standard, a tool wielded by the monarchy better than any sword. And in time, the smell became part of the architecture. It was in the stone, in the plaster, in the drapes it clung to, the tapestries to the inside of crowns. And no matter how many perfumes were poured, how many incense sticks were lit, it remained patient, consistent, honest in its own way. And the maids who scrubbed the same staircases for years began to understand that nothing ever truly came clean, only less visible, less obvious. And so they scrubbed with less urgency, more rhythm, more ritual, because the dirt always returned. And this too was inherited, not just the titles, not just the jewels, but the dirt, the oils, the dead skin cells, the dried blood, the crusted mucus. All of it passed from monarch to monarch like a crown, like a scepter unspoken, but undeniable. And even in death, the cycle continued. The corpses of royalty were prepared not to be clean, but to appear untouched, to seem preserved untouched by time or decay. But the truth was always more grotesque. and the embalmers knew it. The worms arrived quickly. The eyes clouded, the mouths sagged, but makeup and herbs and stiff collars hid what time revealed, and the public was never told the truth. They saw marble statues, cold, perfect, immortal. But beneath the surface, the truth bloomed slowly and silently. And so every generation of royals inherited not only power, but rot. And they were taught to sit still, to smile, to wave, to speak, in tones smooth as velvet, and to never flinch when the cushion beneath them squished with age and the chair arms smelled faintly of urine, to never react when a beloved dog licked their feet and opened a sore, to never ask when the comb was last cleaned or the towel last replaced, because asking was rebellion and rebellion was treason. And so they learned to endure, and endurance became elegance, and elegance became power. And the people watched and whispered and mimicked and built their own illusions of cleanliness, of purity, of class, and they bought soaps named after queens, lotions scented with imagined gardens of palaces, shampoos promising royal softness. And none of it worked, because none of it was real, and what they were chasing was not cleanliness, but narrative. The myth that somewhere behind the grime, behind the gowns, behind the smiles, there was a kind of beauty untouched by the mess of flesh. And this myth persists still in documentaries and biographies and reenactments. But if you scratch the surface, just once, if you follow the trail of scent instead of sight, you will find it again. The truth waiting beneath the marble, the wool, the lace, the disinfectants of modernity. You will find the chamber pot, the crusted lace, the shared toothbrush, worms in the wig box, and you will realize that the real inheritance of monarchy is not glory or legacy, but endurance, the ability to rot politely and smile through the stench. And that is the history we are not taught. That is the sleep we are rocked into dreaming. That is the lullaby of palaces, a song of sweet denial and perfumed lies. There are rooms in royal palaces that no one speaks of, not because they are secret, but because they are inconvenient. Their existence threatens the story, the fantasy of elegance and grace, and so they are left off the tour, maps unmentioned and books absent. From portraits, these rooms are narrow, dark, low-ceilinged, smelling of mildew and soap long. Gone the cleaning rooms, the servants' quarters, the linen closets, the passageways behind the walls, where air stood still, where rot lingered, where truth hid in plain scent. And it is here that the real royal hygiene was managed, not in gold basins or perfumed baths, but in buckets, in rags, and chipped basins stained with iron and time. And the people who worked in these rooms did not wear wigs or lace. They wore sweat and grime, and silence, their hands cracked from lie, their backs bent from hauling piss-soaked sheets, their fingers raw from scrubbing vomit from velvet. And they were never photographed, never named, never remembered. And yet their work was the foundation of the royal illusion. Their labor masked the filth. Their suffering made beauty possible. And even in these hidden corners, the smells refused to die. They soaked into the brick, into the beams, into the backs of tapestries. And no matter how much lavender was burned or vinegar was boiled, the stench remained, and so did the habits of avoidance. And these habits became generational rituals, passed down like recipes for silence. How to fold a cloth to hide a stain, how to sprinkle crushed mint along the edges of a chamber pot, how to pour oil along floorboards to trap lice, how to light candles, not for warmth or light, but to melt tallow that could mask feces. And these methods were never written, only shown, only whispered, only suffered. And the royals above carried on unbothered, unaware, sometimes half aware, choosing not to ask why the corridors smelled faintly of cabbage, or why their dressing gowns were stiff at the cuffs, or why their pillows crunched faintly when pressed. And when they did ask, the answers were stories, not truths. Explanations crafted to soothe, not inform. And so the cycle held, and the rooms grew darker, the smells grew stronger, and still no one spoke, and the air itself became thick, a kind of soup of decay and habit. And the windows in these corridors were nailed shut to prevent drafts, but also, too, trap secrets, to keep the smell in, to prevent the world from knowing, and the drapes were never washed. Only beaten, only hung, only admired, and beneath them rodents bred and died and bred again, and the cats brought in to hunt them added their own musk to the blend, and the floors warped from moisture and time, and still no one are. It placed them because to replace was to admit decay, and decay was not royal. And when guests arrived, they were shown only the marble, the chandeliers, the curated scent of orange blossom and myrrh piped in through cleverly placed bowls, steaming water behind thrones, behind harps, behind tapestries, and even those scents mask something older, something primal. The smell of bodies, the smell of time, and these smells became ghosts, and the ghosts became tradition, and tradition became law. And even today, if you stand in certain corridors of certain castles, you can feel it in your throat, a dry rasp, a reminder of what has not been cleaned, what cannot be cleaned, what was built not to be seen. And when the royals sat down to dine at tables set with crystal and silver, they did so inches above the crust of centuries, the layer of dust and sweat and mouse droppings hidden by rugs beaten, but never washed. And when they lifted their glasses, they toasted to health while flies circled unnoticed, drawn to the grease on collars, to the sweetness of decay in the folds of lace. And the servants waved them away with fans. Not because they cared, but because they were trained to maintain the fiction, and fiction was everything. And when a servant died from infection or collapsed from fumes, it was not recorded as such. It was recorded as fatigue or old age or accident, because naming the truth was more dangerous than the truth itself. And so, the books remain clean, even if the walls do not, and the letters remain sweet, even if the breath was sour, and the images remain gleaming, even if the floors were sticky, and the chairs damp. And this dissonance is the true heritage. Not crowns, not castles, not lineage, but contradiction. The ability to rot with dignity, to smile with sores, to perfume over puss. And in the royal nurseries, the cycle began anew. Babies wrapped in heirloom cloths, stored in cedar that hid mold their cribs, carved with symbols of purity, but gnawed by beetles. Their teething toys made of bone and lead, and their nannies told to sing, not to clean, to hush, not to question. And the children grew into heirs, and the heirs into monarchs, and the pattern repeated, and the walls kept their breath, and the corridors their secrets, and the rooms their ghosts, and the people their silence. And that is the true layout of a palace. Not what is seen, but what is smelled. Not what is said, but what is ignored. Not what is remembered, but what refuses to die. And this is the lullaby sung by stone, the song of old soap and older secrets. And this is what you feel in your bones when you walk the halls. Not awe, not wonder, not beauty, but something older, something sour, something stubborn, and that is history. There is something sacred in repetition, not because it is holy, but because it is safe. The same movement, the same tool, the same lie, repeated until it becomes indistinguishable from truth. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the grooming habits of British royals, rituals repeated, not for cleanliness, but for control, for symbolism, for maintenance of image. Not hygiene, and the tools of these rituals were rarely cleaned themselves. Silver combs encrusted with decades of oil and hair brushed each morning with reverence. Not sanitation, ivory-handled razors stained and dulled, passed from father to son, polished but never sterilized, the polish merely moving the dirt around, creating a sheen that suggested purity, while harboring rot. And these objects became heirlooms. The dirt inside them became memory. Memory became legacy, and no one questioned it. And if a monarch developed a rash from an inherited brush, it was deemed delicate skin, not filth. If a queen's scalp festered beneath a tiara, it was blamed on nerves, not lice, because the object was too holy to be doubted, too historic to be cleaned. And so the rituals continued, and attendants trained for years on the correct sequence of application powders before perfumes, oils before cloths, never the reverse. Not because it worked, but because it was tradition. And the powders themselves were made of crushed pearls of chalk of lead dust that dried the skin, cracked it, filled pores, and hid disease behind a matte finish. And the perfumes were thick, heavy, distilled not to delight, but to smother, to bury the stench of the body under something equally aggressive musk and civet and decayed flowers, their sweetness sickening their longevity, monstrous and... The oils were rancid but expensive, their turn masked by rose, essence by saffron, by stories, and stories mattered more than smell, and the cloths were stiff from use, from age, from the bodily oils of monarchs long dead, and no one dared replace them because they had once touched royalty, and to wash them was to erase history. And so they were folded, lined, stored, revered, and returned to the skin like relics. And the attendants never spoke of the infections, never spoke of the boils of the fungus growing under nail beds, of the pus that soaked through royal gloves. They simply adjusted the angle of the pyre, sleeved the cut of the sea, off the lighting of the portrait, and continued, and in doing so, they became the true architects of monarchy. Not the masons, not the ministers, not the generals, but the polishers, the scrubbers, the dusters, the concealment artists, and they understood what no outsider did, that the body of a monarch is not a body. It is a symbol, and symbols must not smell, must not bleed, must not break, and so when they did, when the skin cracked and oozed and stank, the response was not healing, but hiding more powder, more silk, more story, and the monarch learned early not to complain, not to scratch, not to wince, because to acknowledge the itch was to destroy the illusion, and illusion was power, and so they endured and taught their children to endure. And the tools were passed on with instructions and curses and names and stains, and still no one washed them. And when new tools were made, they were made in the old way, with old logic, from old materials, not because they worked, but because they matched the aesthetic of tradition. And so silver bath thermometers that didn't read correctly were used over and over, baths drawn too hot, too cold, and no one adjusted because adjustment was rebellion. And rebellion smelled like truth, and the royal mouth, too, was governed by these same laws. Golden toothpicks, reused between meals, rinsed in wine, but never boiled tongue scrapers, carved from bone, passed from tongue to tongue between generations of decay. Toothbrushes, made of boar bristle and wood, softened by mold, kept in velvet cases lined with silk that smelled faintly of rot. And when gums bled, it was said to be passion when teeth blackened. It was painted over, and still they smiled, and still they were admired, and the plates they ate from were scrubbed by hand with cloths that never dried fully, cloths that hung in humid rooms growing their own kingdoms of bacteria. And yet those cloths were prized because they had cleaned royal spoons, and when the china cracked, it was sealed with lead and kept because it had been used by a king, and the lead seeped into the food and the blood. And no one said a word, and so the royal body slowly poisoned itself. Not from war, not from treason, but from reverence, from ritual, from fear of breaking the cycle. And that cycle included the chambermaids, the valets, the dressers, the wig stylists, all trained to never ask, only nod, only listen, only endure, and they learned to fake the scent of lemon with vinegar and the scent of roses with mold, and to polish chamber pots with ash and spit and linen that once served as a napkin for a monarch. And this reuse, this layering of purpose and filth became its own form of worship, a kind of tactile gospel where every object told a story, and every story hid a truth, and the truth was that nothing was ever truly clean, only arranged, rearranged, disguised, and revered. And that arrangement was everything, and that reverence was demanded, and any servant who broke the pattern, who suggested a new cloth, a boiled tool, a modern replacement, was dismissed quietly and quickly, because change was contamination, and contamination was heresy, and so the brushes remained stiff, the perfumes remained thick, the sores remained red, and the history remained golden, and no one noticed the contradiction, or rather everyone did, but chose not to speak, because The silence was also tradition, and tradition smelled like roses, soaked in urine, like lace lined with mildew, like crowns worn over scabs, and no one said a word. The most dangerous thing about filth is not its presence, but its transformation, the way it becomes. Something else, something less. Threatening, more poetic, more historical. And the royals mastered this long ago. The art of converting stench into story, of turning grime into grandeur, of masking bodily decay, with language, with ritual, with distance. They did not clean. They reframed, and in that reframing, a sour odor became musk, a crust of sweat became a sacred garment, a worm-eaten wig became a symbol of dignity. And so the dirt remained, but its meaning shifted, and that shift was everything. Because once dirt becomes tradition, it can no longer be questioned, only worshipped. And this worship was evident everywhere, not just in the tools or the clothes, but in the architecture itself. The way palaces were designed not to ventilate, but to impress high ceilings to carry sound, not air narrow staircases to control access, not flow thick drapes, not for privacy, but for performance. And behind those drapes, mold thrived insects, bread. And the air thickened, and yet no one changed the drapes, because they had hung there for generations, because a king had once sneezed into them, or a queen had once touched them, and that single gesture made the fabric holy and therefore untouchable. And so it rotted in place, and so did the walls, and so did the floors. And yet the rot was narrated, not scrubbed, and this narration became the way through the stink. An entire vocabulary developed to handle the unclean, not to remove it, but to make it acceptable, to elevate it. Euphemisms, metaphors, and turns of phrase that painted the foul as refined and the disgusting as divine. And so a toilet became a necessary, a fart, a royal breeze, a pustule, a rosebud of the skin. And no one laughed because the language was armor, because to laugh was to break the spell, and the spell was fragile and old and sacred, and beneath that spell, real bodies suffered, bled, itched, festered, but no one spoke of it aloud, only in ledgers, only in code discrete notations of concerns, of episodes, of temperamental digestion, which meant diarrhea, which meant parasites, which meant weeks of fever behind velvet doors. And still the narrative held, and the bodies were paraded, and the paintings painted them flawless, and the coins bore their profiles smooth as marble, and no one dared suggest the truth, that beneath the powdered neck was a rash beneath the glove, a wart beneath the lace, a sore leaking slowly into the fabric of monarchy. And even when the truth threatened to surface, when a stench became too strong or a sickness too visible, the response was not to confront it, but to perfume it more deeply, to ritualize the decay, to fold it into tradition. And so a rotting tooth became a rite of passage, a collapsed bowel, a lesson in divine humility. And these were written into letters, into journals, into memoirs, as moments of character, of strength, of royal endurance. And so illness became virtue, and pain became nobility, and the stink became the incense of legacy, and those who cleaned it, those who carried away the cloth soaked in sweat and blood and feces, were not given thanks or credit, only silence, only obscurity, only orders to be quicker, to be quieter, to be invisible. And still they did the work, because the work was older than them, older than kings, older than laws, because the work was myth. Maintenance and myths are powerful and filthy and durable. And when modernity came, when pipes were laid and sewage systems installed, when soap was mass-produced and knowledge of bacteria became common, still the palaces hesitated. Still, they clung to the old ways, to the basins, to the cloths, to the stories. Because change is loss, and loss smells worse than shit. And so they hired engineers to make the new look like the old toilets, disguised as throne sinks carved like baptismal fonts, showers hidden behind tapestry doors, and all of it made to preserve the illusion that nothing had changed, that the old ways were still pure, still superior, still royal, and when guests came, they were shown the marble, not the mold, the chandelier, not the flies, the courtyard, not the cistern, and they left believing the lie, because the lie was beautiful and easy and pleasant, and smelled of orange blossom and rosewater and denial, and so the dirt lived on underfoot, under skin, under narrative, and it lives on still in archives, in memoirs and ghosted perfumes, in the corners of rooms where light never reaches, and in the pauses of documentaries, the edits of biographies, the polite silences of official tours. Because some truths are too pungent and too sacred to name, and so they persist like mildew in velvet, like wax, hardened with piss like memory. And that is the true stench of royalty. Not just what is hidden, but what is believed. Not just what is buried, but what is framed. Not just what is disgusting, but what is canonized. And so when you walk those halls, when you breathe that air, know that you inhale history. Not just the golden glory, but the sweat and pus and fermented pride. And that is the lullaby of the palace, the hum beneath the harp, the scent beneath the crown, the echo beneath the anthem. That is why it never leaves you. Cleanliness as a concept is never neutral. It is always political, always wielded, always defined by someone with the power to enforce their version of pure. And nowhere was this more evident than in the royal courts of Britain, where the illusion of hygiene became more important than its reality, where the appearance of cleanliness was enough to write laws, declare wars, or sanctify marriages, and beneath the silks and scents lay a truth so foul it could only be hidden, never cured, and yet it shaped the nation. It shaped the colonies, it shaped the world, and it began each morning in chambers where attendants approached sleeping monarchs, not to wake them gently, but to cleanse them ceremonially, to wipe their eyelids with rosewater, not to remove dirt, but to perform reverence, to brush their gums with wine, not to kill bacteria, but to affirm tradition, to comb their hair with tortoiseshell bristles, brittle with age, and thick with inherited dandruff. And no one questioned this, because questioning it was akin to treason, because a monarch's filth was divine by proxy, and divine filth could not be critiqued, only catalogued. And so ledgers filled with quiet horror notes on boils, on eruptions, on discharges described in the language of civility. A rash became an irritation of temper, a lesion, a delicate bloom. And if a king's excrement came out bloody, it was marked as vermilion passage, as though poetry could mask sepsis. And still the rituals went on. And when the monarch stood to piss in a golden urinal, shaped like a lion's mouth, attendants bowed, not because they respected the act, but because they had been taught the act itself was sacred, that to collect a royal stool was to carry a relic, and the stool was then passed to physicians, who smelled it, tasted it, examined it, and wrote their findings in Latin so the stink might be disguised by syllables, and no one asked why a god-king bled from the bowels, only how best to mix powdered clove and cinnamon to hide the scent during court. And so the excrement defined foreign policy, and the pus-shaped protocol and the hemorrhoids determined the length of an audience, and everyone knew, and no one said it, and this knowledge formed a second court, a darker one, where those who carried waste held more power than those who carried scrolls, where the laundress knew more than the advisor, where the one who dressed the wound knew which treaty would stall, which war would delay, which alliance would fail because the king was not well, and to speak that aloud was unthinkable. And so they sang of his strength while packing his ulcer with wool soaked in brine, and whispered his glory while his urine corroded silver, and they smiled because smiling was safer, and silence was rewarded, and eventually this silence was mistaken for truth. And this mistake became law, and this law became culture, and so centuries passed, and the stench deepened, and the perfumes thickened, and the bodies rotted in brocade, and the nation moved on, thinking itself clean, because the palace glowed at dusk, because the carpets muffled every step, because the chandeliers sparkled with 1,000 candles, and no one looked down. No one lifted the cushions. No one checked the drains. And beneath that neglect, fungus grew and rodents nested and corpses of forgotten attendants crumbled in crawl spaces. And yet the royal dinner was served on time each evening, and the cutlery gleamed with inherited shine, and the guests spoke in French and ate in silence, and never once mentioned the roach that scurried beneath the table or the blood that dried behind the curtain. And this denial became elegance, and this elegance became gospel. And when journalists finally entered, when cameras rolled and books were written, they captured the light, not the smell. They described the gowns, not the lice. They framed the lineage, not the lesions. And so the cycle continued, and when modern royals stepped into glossy bathrooms with heated tiles and automatic fans and citrus soap, they still paused, they still hesitated, they still looked for the rosewater bowl, for the chamber pot with gilded feet, for the cloth napkin meant not for the mouth but for the groin, because muscle remembers what mind forgets. And their bodies flinched at chlorine, their hands recoiled at plastic, and somewhere deep inside them a voice whispered, "This is not regal, this is not clean," because clean had been redefined long ago, not as sterile, but as sacred, not as sanitary, but as symbolic. And that voice still governs. And that governance still shapes the way curtains are washed, or not washed, the way portraits are lit, the way bathrooms are described as powder rooms and toilets as restrooms, and that governance is filth disguised as etiquette, and that etiquette is armor against the human, against the base, against the body. And when a modern monarch dies, we still ask what they wore, not how they smelled. We still frame their legacy in velvet, not vinegar. And in doing so, we preserve the lie that the crown is above the flesh, that gold resists bacteria, that royalty is a filter against odor, but it isn't, and it never was. And behind every sapphire ring lies a callus, and under every golden clasp a rash, and in every coronation chair a stain. And still we believe, because belief is cleaner than truth. To govern through cleanliness is to create a border between the sacred and the profane, to draw an invisible line that separates the worthy from the unworthy, the chosen from. The masses and the British royal family did this, not with declarations or weapons, but with cloth, with water, with scent and silence. And it began in whispers behind doors, behind gloves, behind perfumes, where filth was not denied, but redirected. The monarch did not sweat, he glistened, he did not rot, he matured, he did not decay, he transitioned. And in that language lay dominion, because if your dirt is divine, then theirs is heresy. And this logic governed court and colony alike. And so subjects scrubbed their floors while palaces dried their linens in scented smoke, and poor children were beaten for soiling their shirts, while princes slept in sheets unchanged for weeks, because royalty was not judged by standards, it set them. And so dirt became proof of divinity. When royal feet stained marble, the marble was revered. When royal breath stank of ulcered gums, the breath was deemed prophetic. When royal wounds festered, they were touched like relics. And so cleanliness itself became a hierarchy, not of health, but of access. And those closest to the filthiest monarchs held the most power because they were trusted with the truth, and those who smelled the worst were considered the most noble, because only nobility could carry the odor of authority, and no soap could wash it away. No herb, no salve, no science, and this became policy hygiene, as pageantry stench as signal. And while reformers built toilets and pumped water into tenements, while midwives preached washing hands and boiling linens, the palace held firm. It whispered of tradition, of immunity, of divine right. And so the filth remained sacred, and subjects emulated not the soap, but the ritual. They bought lavender, not for cleansing, but for signaling. They perfumed letters, not to mask, but to mimic. They refused to speak of menstruation, not out of shame, but out of mimicry, because silence was royal. And if the royals did not bleed publicly, then neither would they. And in this way, hygiene was never about health. It was about theater, about fealty, about distance. And that distance governed everything from foreign courts to local courts to courtships. And the rules of bathing became codes of rank. You could not wash above your station. You could not bathe more often than your liege. You could not smell fresher than your superior. And when the queen used violet oil, it was treasonous to copy her blend. When the king chewed cardamom, it was sacrilegious to do the same, and so odor became trademark, and trademark became law, and law became lifestyle, and this extended to furniture, to decor, to architecture. The royal commode had curves that no other could replicate. The bath had fixtures that mimicked relics. The soap was shaped like national emblems, and even the towels bore crests that meant nothing functionally but everything socially. And those crests protected the towel from wiping real dirt. They were for drying illusions, not bodies. And so, the real cleaning happened in secret, or not at all. And illness bloomed beneath silk, and disease festered beneath lace. And still the guests bowed. Still the portraits glowed, still the gardens bloomed, and beneath the roses, the drainage pipes overflowed, and the sewage was carted in silence, because to speak of it was to violate the spell, and that spell was law, stronger than parliament, deeper than blood, and every dynasty reinforced it, and every coronation perfumed it, and every scandal buried it. And when the modern age arrived with sterilizers and germ theory and latex gloves, the royals pretended to comply. They cut ribbons at hospitals, they endorsed health campaigns. They smiled beside microscopes, but behind palace walls, nothing changed. The old ways remained: the cloth, not the wipe; the basin, not the flush; the sponge, not the spray. And they did this not out of ignorance, but out of control, because modernity equalized, and they could not afford equality. Because if a butcher could be cleaner than a baron, if a maid could be healthier than a marchioness, then the order cracked, then the illusion broke, and so they preserved filth as a mark of distance. They embraced discomfort as a sign of breeding. They held their bowels like secrets, and their infections like jewels. And when a royal died of dysentery, the eulogy called it a mysterious decline. When a noble rotted from syphilis, the epitaph spoke of melancholy. And when a princess gave birth in blood and screams, the public was told of a peaceful arrival. And this lie governed everything, not because it was believed, but because it was required, because truth stank and lies perfumed, and the kingdom needed perfume to sleep at night. There is a kind of cleanliness that only exists in memory, a fabricated kind, a nostalgic glow, painted over filth with enough distance to seem divine, and nowhere is this more visible than in the stories we still tell about the British royals, where hygiene becomes an aesthetic choice and not a necessity, where discomfort becomes quaint and not cruel, where odors become part of the charm and not a warning. And the further we drift from the truth, the easier it becomes to romanticize it, to laugh at chamber pots, without smelling them, to admire gowns, without knowing they were reused for decades, unwashed, to marvel at wigs, without understanding they teemed with lice. And this distance allows myth to settle myth, that royalty was always graceful, always composed, always fragrant. And this myth begins in portraits where the king's hand rests on a globe and his teeth are hidden behind a closed mouth, where the queen looks serene despite chronic abscesses and pustules under her corset, where the child prince stands tall, never showing the bandages beneath his tights. And we believe these images because they are silent, because silence protects the illusion, and that illusion is stronger than any soap, any brush, any bath, because it survives, even when truth is known. And that is the legacy of royal hygiene. Not that it was absent, but that it was transformed, made symbolic, weaponized, ritualized, and finally erased from view, until only the story remains, and the story is clean, and that story is told in textbooks and documentaries and museum plaques and guided tours, where docents whisper of royal perfumes and bath rituals and grooming habits as though they were art forms and not survival mechanisms, and they describe rosewater bowls as heirlooms, not sanitation. Substitutes, they praise scented gloves without mentioning the rot they concealed. They list exotic ingredients in pomades without explaining what they were hiding. And so the lie lives. The lie that dirt was dignity, that boils were beauty, that bleeding gums were badges of refinement, and that every gesture from dipping a comb to dabbing a cheek was not about infection, but about elegance, and this lie became fashionable. It spread. Through aristocracy, through literature, through fiction and theater, and the noble stench became a genre. It shaped the way characters were written, the way villains were dressed, the way suffering was aestheticized, and it gave birth to a kind of rot that wasn't visible, but was everywhere, a narrative. Rot, a cultural infection that told generations to imitate the wrong things, to fear the wrong odors, to associate class with distance from water. And this legacy lingers. It lingers in royal reenactments, in historical dramas, in perfumes. Branded with crests and napkins, embroidered with initials. Lingers in the way we describe gowns without undergarments, in the way we whisper of seductions that happened without bathing. It lingers in the way we excuse decay as romance and excess as tradition. And it blinds us to the suffering it covered, to the ulcers lanced in silence, to the bodies wrapped in brocade, while festering beneath, to the children perfumed but never scrubbed, to the queens who miscarried in unwashed beds, to the kings who died not from war but from neglect. And when we say their names today, we speak of Windsor and Tudor, and Stuart and Plantagenet, and we recall battles and treaties and airs, but not the flies, not the lice, not the pus, not the truth. And that is the power of the myth, not just to rewrite history, but to perfume it. And that perfume lasts longer than any soap, and so it survives in palace gift shops, in tourism campaigns, in coronation speeches and wedding broadcasts, in the way people still camp outside Buckingham Palace to glimpse a royal who once bled into his socks and hid it beneath a smile. And even now, even today, when the walls are painted and the tiles scrubbed and the faucets run hot, the smell remains not in the air, but in the memory, in the way we refuse to ask the real questions, in the way we protect the image at all cost, in the way we'd rather believe a fairy tale than admit we worshiped dirt and crowned it and gave it a name and passed it down. There are legacies that shine, and others that fester. Some histories are etched in marble, others sink into the folds of fabric and rot slowly. And what the British royals left behind was not only a lineage or a realm, but a method, a system, a blueprint for how to mask decay with ritual, how to turn absence of hygiene into a presence of majesty. And it started not in public proclamations, but in private moments, in the curl of a finger, the tilt of a jaw, the stillness of a courtier who held a basin but never used it, in the silence that followed the word cleanse, not with water, but with incense and the notion, spread like smoke, that to wash was to admit, and to admit was to fall. And royals could not fall, and so they floated above it all, immune not by blood but by denial. And in this denial, a philosophy bloomed, a quiet doctrine that taught servants to perfume wounds instead of bandaging them to hide bloodstains, in folds of velvet to open windows, not to let air in, but to let illusion out. And the courtiers learned to praise not cleanliness, but control the ability to endure odor without flinching, to smile through stench, to compliment a monarch's fragrance when it was clearly infection. And they called this grace, and they called it divine, and they passed it down like scripture, not just within palaces, but outward, into every noble household, into schools, into paintings, into parliaments, where the standard was never truth but poise. And so entire generations were taught to pretend to bathe with waterless rituals, to sit still while lice wandered across powdered wigs, to believe that pain was elegant, and that sweat was for peasants. And when water did appear, it was not for use, but for show, poured slowly from crystal ewers into golden bowls that reflected nothing but candlelight and illusion. And this illusion held power real. Power that shaped diplomacy and fashion and medicine. Because if a royal did not bathe, then why should a bishop? And if a bishop did not bathe, then why should a judge? And if a judge could smell like mold and still command respect, then so could a merchant. And suddenly hygiene was no longer a human need, but a class marker, and abstaining from it became a form of belonging. And the further you were from soap, the closer you were to court. And still the diseases spread, still the children died, still the skin cracked, and the mouths rotted, and no one changed. Because the rot had been renamed. It was called patina. It was called history. It was called tradition. And to question, it was to insult not just a person, but a bloodline. And so the myth metastasized, and it found new forms in new eras in modernity, dressed as nostalgia, in documentaries voiced in reverent tones, in colognes that claimed to mimic the musk of kings, and in reenactments where actors smeared with rose oil claimed authenticity while ignoring the boils beneath the lace. And the truth disappeared, not suddenly, but piece by piece, replaced by words like opulence and ceremonial and heritage, and all of it built on the foundation of dirt hidden, not beneath tiles, but beneath words, beneath ceremony, beneath expectation. And when critics emerged, when physicians warned, when revolutionaries scoffed, they were silenced not by force, but by ridicule, because how dare you question elegance? How dare you accuse the monarch of stench? And that was the genius of it, not to kill opposition, but to laugh it away, to bury it under silk and silver and pass it off as eccentricity. And so the royal body remained sacred, untouchable, even as it decayed. And when a king's foot blackened from gangrene, they called it gout. And when a queen fainted from fever, they called it nerves. And when a prince screamed through sleepless nights, they said he was artistic. And in those euphemisms lay the truth of royal hygiene, that it was never about health, it was about language. And if you could rename every symptom, then you never had a problem. And this language trickled down into newspapers, into court records, into prayers whispered by trembling hands who begged for healing but never dared say infection. And so the palaces became altars, and the filth became relics, and the silence became law. And this law endured even into centuries of science and sanitation. Even as plumbing crept into cottages, even as children learned to wash before meals, even as hospitals sterilized their tools, the royal standard remained untouched, not because it worked, but because it ruled. And that rule was simple: to control the story. And the story would control the people. And so they never told the truth about what stained the sheets, what swarmed the curls, what soaked the throne. They told a tale about divine light, about chosen flesh, about unbroken lineage, and beneath that tale, the air soured, and no one breathed it aloud. And that was the point. It was not a secret. It was a system, a vast coordinated ritual in which dirt was not ignored, but cataloged, preserved, labeled, and assigned ceremonial value. And in the palaces of Britain, where marble cracked under centuries of footfall and portraits, yellowed behind crystal glass, cleanliness was not merely avoided, it was rewritten. And the rewriting happened slowly, with ink and oil and velvet and lace, not in rebellion, but in rehearsal, in the everyday acts of monarchy, where washing was replaced by witnessing, where a servant held a towel not to use it, but to display it, folded with precision, a symbol not of use, but of readiness. And in this readiness, the illusion thrived because the towel was present, the basin was present, the rosewater sat uncapped, the hand extended but never reached, and the people watched and believed, because ritual is louder than fact. And when repeated enough, it becomes memory, and memory becomes proof. And so the royal court moved through its days, perfumed and powdered and rotting, and no one dared interrupt the performance, because the performance was the throne. And if you question the scent, you question the crown. And so servants learned not to scrub, but to bow, not to disinfect, but to arrange petals around the chamber pot, not to replace sheets, but to realign them. And when a king sweated through his garments, they changed the outer layer and called it fashion. When a queen's breath soured from decay, they lit a clove and called it grace. And every function of the body was hidden, wrapped, rebranded, and never named. And this silence extended outward into society, where lords copied it, priests blessed it, authors romanticized it, and tailors sewed it into every hem, cuff, until the smell of unwashed nobility was no longer an offense, but an expectation. And to bathe became vulgar, to cleanse became suspect, To scrub one's skin was seen as stripping away status, as if water could rinse away divine right. And so dirt became armor. The thicker, the better, the older, stronger. And this armor was polished with words, not soaps, with legacy, not linen, and the more a monarch reeked, the more sacred they appeared, because only the untouchable could ignore the primal needs and only the eternal could pretend they had no body. And so the monarchs ascended not by rising but by decaying proudly in place. And the court followed and the church obeyed, and the people watched and held their breath and called it perfume, and it was not just smell, it was texture, the crust at the edges of a sleeve, the stiffness of fabric coated in years of sweat, the brittle hair powdered until it broke the skin, painted and layered, until it could no longer breathe. And when a royal scratched at a sore, the gesture was choreographed when they collapsed from fever. It was staged when they died. It was mythologized, and their legacy was not their achievements or reforms, but the scent they left behind, the echo of rituals unbroken and fetid, and no one wanted to be the one who washed it away. And so they preserved it, embalmed it in custom, in law, in etiquette, in legend, in future kings, inherited not just titles, but instructions on how not to bathe, and future queens were taught not just to curtsy, but to ignore the lice, and the palace walls absorbed it all, layer after layer of soapless centuries. And even when the world changed, when plumbing arrived and doctors whispered of bacteria in cities, paved their streets, and public health campaigns began, the palaces resisted, not with force, with softness, with velvet-lined denial, and candle-lit fantasy. And so inside the royal rooms, the water never truly flowed. It glistened, it reflected, it existed as metaphor, not medicine, and the myth held strong. The myth that filth was noble, that suffering was ceremonial, that a monarch's discomfort was everyone else's pride, and that cleanliness was for those who could not endure. And to this day, the echoes remain in the language, in the tourism, in the relics, in the silence that surrounds the word bath, in the way people marvel at royal traditions without asking what they meant or whom they harmed, in the way they smell history and call it musk and whisper it's authentic. There is a difference between forgetting and preserving, and the British royal legacy of filth was never forgotten. It was curated, catalogued, and performed. It did not fade, it calcified, and the more the world evolved, the more the palaces remained fixed, fossilized in velvet, and lace a museum of unwashed power behind gates in gold leaf. And this preservation was not neglect, it was ritual, because every ritual needs a story. And the story was this, that the monarch was more than mortal and mortals bathed, and so the monarch's touch could heal, but soap would diminish it, that suffering proved sanctity. And so discomfort was worn like a crown, and thus the dirt remained, not just on the skin, but in the symbolism. And the symbolism was everywhere, in the untouched basins, the sealed fountains, the handkerchiefs never used, the gloves worn indoors, the powdered wigs refilled instead of cleaned, the perfumes layered, not to scent but to smother, and every detail was sacred, because it had been done before, and what had been done before was always right, and that belief was more powerful than soap, more enduring than fever. It outlasted plagues and revolutions, and reason itself. And when new monarchs were crowned, they inherited more than robes. They inherited the choreography, the script, the choreography of not flinching when a sore opened, of smiling when a servant swatted flies from the crown of your wig, of posing in paintings that never hinted at the ulcers beneath the silk. And this choreography extended beyond the body into the architecture, the furniture, the textiles, every cushion embroidered, not with cleanliness, but with memory, every corridor echoing the breath of generations, who inhaled sickness and called it sanctity. And when modern medicine arrived, it was ushered into the palaces like a guest, not a savior allowed to sit but not to speak, because the body politic could not admit its own wounds, and so it wore them like heirlooms, the boils, the scabs, the rashes not hidden, but exalted behind euphemism and perfume, and any attempt to cleanse was treated as treason, as if the wiping of a brow might erase a dynasty. and thus the legacy endured and passed silently into the minds of those who watched the ceremonies, who read the memoirs, who stood at the gates hoping for a glimpse. And what they glimpsed was not power, but its costume. And the costume was stitched with bacteria and breath and belief. And the belief was that this was eternal. This dirt, this decay, this slow-rotting splendor was not a failure of hygiene, was the essence of monarchy, and so it echoed beyond the palace walls into the textbooks that praised restraint, into the films that showed opulence but never latrines, into the soaps named after queens who never used them, and the museums filled with chamber pots polished and dignified, and no one asked how they smelled, only who they belonged to, and the blood-stained linens were reframed as relics, the lice combs displayed with reverence, the surgical tools placed behind velvet ropes, and the story told again and again was not of illness, but of elegance, and when the truth was whispered, dismissed as vulgar, as unpatriotic, because to say the king reeked was to betray the flag. And so the truth slept beneath gold leaf and silence. And in that silence, generations learned to ignore their senses, to disbelieve their noses, to see decay and call it duty. And thus the myth survived stronger than flesh. And smarter than soap, it wormed its way into every ballad, every procession, every coronation. And even now, when water flows freely and antiseptic is common, even now, the ceremonies continue unchanged, and the towels remain unused, and the perfumes overwhelm, and the bodies beneath remain mysteries wrapped in layers of expectation and denial. And no one asks how often the throne is cleaned, because the answer might crack the glass of legacy, and no one wants to see the mold behind the crown. And so the system endures immaculate in its filth and celebrated in its rot. And this is not irony, is power. The power to define reality, not by evidence, but by inheritance. The power to say this is royal, and to make it so not through virtue, but through repetition. And so the filth continues, not by accident, but by design. And that design is called heritage, and that heritage is displayed in every portrait, in every headline, in every collective nod that says yes. This is how it should be, not because it is right, but because it always has been and always will be. It was never just about dirt. It was about direction, about where power pointed and what it chose to ignore. And in the case of the British royals, that direction was always inward, not introspective, but insulated, as if the walls of the palace did not protect from danger, but from doubt, and cleanliness was the most dangerous doubt of all, because it suggested something needed to be fixed. And monarchs were not to be fixed. They were to be endured. And this endurance required stagnation, a freezing of customs, a fossilization of rituals. And so the grime was not accidental, it was curated with a purpose. It made the sacred untouchable, the royal unreachable, because a clean king might be mistaken for a man and a clean queen for a woman, and the system could not afford that mistake. And so the rituals formed a seal, a lacquer over flesh and breath and waste, and the people were taught to worship the lacquer, not the being beneath, and in this worship a strange form of blindness bloomed, not the blindness of those in the dark, but of those who stare too long at gold. And the glare of tradition was blinding, and it told them not to ask where the bathwater went, or if the sheets were ever laundered, but to marvel at the embroidery on the pillow that never moved, and to comment not on the odor in the throne room, but on the symmetry of its arches. And when illness came, when sores opened and teeth fell and gowns hid festering skin, the sickness was recast as suffering, and suffering as sacrifice, and sacrifice as sanctity. And sanctity needed no soap, only silence. And so the silence grew thick in the corridors. It clung to the velvet, crept into the wood grain of antique furniture, and when servants whispered, they did so behind curtains, and when doctors wrote, they used euphemism, and when visitors gagged, they called it the air of history. And this history was not written in books. It was worn, it was smelled, it was tasted in the bitterness of lead powder and the coppery tang of blood on embroidered cuffs, in the dryness of perfumed wigs that cracked like old paint, and the royals carried it all, not as burden, but as blessing, because it separated them from the world, and that separation was the very definition of rule, because you cannot lead what you resemble. You must remain apart, and filth was the most effective wall, because it required no guards, no proclamations, only repetition. And once repeated enough, it became invisible. And once invisible, it became truth. And the truth was that a royal body was not a body. It was a myth, and myths do not bathe, and myths do not itch, and myths do not flinch. And so the monarchs sat still through the heat, through the rot, through the plague, and their stillness was mistaken for strength, and their silence for wisdom, and the people obeyed not because they believed, but because they had forgotten how not to. And in that forgetting, they became custodians of the myth. They polished the grime, they scented the rooms, they rehearsed the genuflections, and no one remembered when it began, and no one dared imagine how it might end. And so the cycle continued, and the royals endured not by cleanliness, but by concealment, by wrapping themselves in fabric and titles and expectation, until the body beneath was no longer theirs, but property of the state, of the tradition, of the illusion. And in that illusion lay the true throne, not the gilded chair, but the lie. So old, it smelled like legacy. And the more it smelled, the more sacred it became. And so they never washed it away. They called it England, and bowed. They did not clean, because to clean would be to remove the past. And the past was their currency. It was their proof, divine, right, their claim to continuity. And if something was removed, it might not return, and that risk was unbearable because their power was not in action but in presence, and presence requires permanence, and permanence requires stasis, and stasis needs a medium, something thick and still and dirt. Perfect, it stayed, it stained it, whispered of age and pain and endurance. And what is a king if not someone who endures? And so the filth endured with him, not around him, but through him. The smell became a signature, the stains, a seal, the rot, a reminder, and the reminder was everywhere in the silence of the kitchens, where no soap was bought, in the corridors, where curtains hid mildew, and the gloves worn to hide skin, and the collars starched until the neck could not turn. And when guests arrived, they nodded through the scent, they bowed beneath the flies, they accepted the illusions, because to reject them would be to reject the system, and the system was old. And to be old was to be right, and this righteousness clung like musk, passed from one sovereign to the next, until the very idea of cleanliness became foreign and suspect and radical, and what is more dangerous than the radical, and so the suggestion of bathing was silenced with laughter, and the question of hygiene deflected with history. And history was the ultimate defense. It answered nothing and justified everything, and the justifications piled up like dust in the rafters, until even the cobwebs were respected as emblems, and the rust was framed as heritage, and the sickness was romanticized, and the decay was called charm. And thus, the lie grew roots deep into architecture, into etiquette, into language. And when a monarch scratched, they called it poise. And when they limped, they called it grace. And when they reeked, they called it musk. And musk was masculine, and rot was regal. And anyone who suggested otherwise was accused of irreverence, of impudence, of ignorance, because to know too much was to become dangerous. And so the truth was buried beneath ceremony, beneath protocol, beneath velvet and lace and linen and powdered wigs and snuff boxes and fans and lace-edged gloves, until the idea of truth itself began to smell like treason, and no one dared ask who washed the sheets or if the crown was ever wiped, because the answer might crumble the illusion, and the illusion was all they had, and it had to shine. And so it was polished daily, but never cleaned, just shined, just adorned, just perfumed. And what was perfume, if not a mask? What was silk, if not a distraction? And what was distraction, if not survival? And the royals survived, not by adaptation, but by avoidance. They sidestepped modernity with a smile. They dodged reform with a nod, and they waited for the world to exhaust itself and return to ritual. And ritual is immune to reason. It only requires memory and repetition. And so they repeated and repeated and repeated until the repetition itself became holy, and the holy became untouchable, and the untouchable never had to bathe, never had to change, never had to explain. And so they didn't. And that non-explanation became the core, the stillness at the heart of the spectacle. And the spectacle was rich and loud and golden, and beneath it, something festered, and the festering was sacred, because it had survived. And survival was virtue, and virtue was unwashed. And so the cycle turned again and again and again, and the people forgot what they smelled and remembered only what they saw, and they saw crowns and carriages and ceremonies and thought, this must be good because it is old, and it is old because it is good. And good things do not need cleaning. They only need believing. And so they believed, and the grime remained. The filth was never just residue. It was narrative. It was an inheritance passed down not through blood but through breath, the kind of breath that lingered in tapestries and oaths and lullabies, the kind that taught children to bow before odor, to kiss hands that had not touched water in weeks, and to believe that to question the smell was to question the crown. And so the smell became holy, and holiness became rank, and rank became rancor, and no one flinched. Because flinching was not regal, and royalty did not flinch. They endured, and their endurance became virtue. And their virtue was broadcast in portraits, in speeches, in polished shoes that hid diseased toes and smiles that masked rot behind teeth, and behind those smiles was a silence louder than thunder. The silence that comes from too many people agreeing not to see, not to smell, not to notice. And in that shared denial was born the true legacy, not the jewels, not the land, not the titles, but the ability to hold your nose and still applaud. And that applause built empires. It paved streets. It lit lamps. It crowned rulers. And in every clapping hand was a finger that once pointed but was told to fold. And so it folded, and the folding became a dance, a curtsy, a pageant. And in that pageant, no one asked why the air in the throne room always tasted of mildew, or why the robes weighed more. With each generation, as if guilt had mass and memory could mold, and mold it did in the cellars, in the scripts, in the spine of every law that protected image over integrity and posture over cleanliness, and that posture became architecture, straight lines, stone faces, marble facades behind which no soap flowed, only lineage and expectation. And behind that expectation was fear. The fear that if the walls were scrubbed too hard, they might dissolve and reveal nothing but flesh, and all flesh smells. And no crown can hide that. But still they tried, they powdered, they perfumed, they staged and restaged and rerouted sewage and buried bathhouses and turned drainage into metaphors, and metaphors into ceremonies. And no one remembered when it started, only that it must not stop, because stopping would be admitting, and admitting would be unraveling, and the kingdom was stitched together with denial, and the denial was scented with rosewater, and the rosewater was sprayed not to cleanse but to confuse, because if the nose is fooled, the mind will follow. And so they followed the carriages, followed the processions, followed the myths, until their feet bled, and their eyes blurred, and their lungs forgot what air without perfume tasted like. And they called it loyalty. And loyalty does not question, it preserves. And what it preserved was not grace but grime, and not dignity but decay. And this decay was dressed in velvet, and walked on red carpets, and sat on gold thrones, and it waved, and people waved back, and in that wave was all of history's breath. The exhale of generations taught to bow before stench and see in its strength. And so the cycle does not end, it merely perfumes itself again. New bottle, same stink. And now the smell is digital, now the grime is PR, now the mold grows in headlines, and no one dares clean it for fear of seeing what lies beneath. And what lies beneath is not royalty but rot, And the rot wears a smile and shakes hands and opens hospitals and waves from balconies, and we wave back. Because it is easier to wave than to ask, and easier to cheer than to scrub. And so we do, and in doing we carry the filth forward, not on our skin, but in our stories, and the stories stay unwashed because we call them tradition. And tradition is sacred, and sacred things do not get cleaned. They get worshipped,